Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to a time before time, to an age when the world existed in a state so raw and untamed that even the gods we know today were nothing more than distant possibilities waiting in the cosmic darkness. Tonight, we journey together into the deepest shadows of Greek mythology, where the familiar stories of Zeus and his Olympian family had not yet begun, where instead the universe trembled under the weight of far more ancient and terrifying powers. Imagine, if you will, a reality where order had not yet imposed itself upon chaos, where the very concept of civilization was as foreign as light itself. In this primordial realm, before the first sunrise ever painted the sky, before the first mountain rose from the earth, before the first drop of rain fell upon waiting soil, there existed only the vast yawning emptiness that the Greeks called chaos. This was not merely an absence of things, but a presence unto itself, a brooding void that contained within its depths all the potential for both creation and destruction. From this endless abyss emerged the first stirrings of existence, and with them came beings so fundamental to reality that they were less like gods and more like the very forces that govern existence itself. Gaia, the earth, materialized from the void, not as a gentle mother figure, but as something far more complex and unsettling, a consciousness that was simultaneously nurturing and ruthlessly pragmatic. She was the ground beneath every step, the soil that would drink blood, the foundation upon which all future horrors and wonders would unfold. Above her stretched Uranus, the sky, vast and encompassing, his star-studded body forming a dome over Gaia's mountains and valleys. Together, these primordial beings would give birth to children who would reshape the cosmos. But their union was far from the harmonious partnership one might expect from the parents of gods. Instead, it was marked by a darkness that would echo through every generation that followed, a pattern of fear, violence, and betrayal that would define the very nature of divine power. As you settle deeper into this ancient tale, let yourself feel the weight of eons pressing down, the sense that you are witnessing the birth of forces so vast and unknowable that even their creators could not fully comprehend what they had unleashed. The air itself seems to whisper with the memory of those first stirrings of consciousness, when the universe was young and every possibility hung suspended like a question waiting for an answer. The birth of the Titans. In the union between earth and sky, something magnificent and terrible was about to emerge. Gaia, with her ancient wisdom, and Uranus, with his infinite expanse, came together in acts of creation that were as violent as they were beautiful, giving birth to beings who would be known throughout all of mythology as the Titans. These were not gods in the sense that we would later understand divinity, with their human-like forms and comprehensible motivations, but rather living embodiments of the fundamental forces that govern reality itself. Picture the moment of their birth, when the very fabric of existence stretched and groaned to accommodate these new forms of consciousness. One by one, they emerged from the depths of their mother's being, each more awe-inspiring and unsettling than the last. Oceanus, whose body was the endless waters that encircled the world, rose with the sound of 10,000 waves crashing against shores that had never known peace. Themis, his sister and eventual consort, brought with her the mysteries of fresh water, of springs and rivers that would carve their way through mountains with patience more enduring than stone. Hyperion blazed into existence as the embodiment of light itself, not the gentle illumination that would later comfort mortals, but the raw, burning essence of radiance that could blind as easily as it could reveal. His very presence made the darkness retreat, though never completely. For shadow and light were destined to dance their eternal dance across the face of creation. Beside him stood Dai, whose brilliance was said to give gold its gleam and gems their fire. A goddess whose beauty was so intense that to look upon her directly was to risk losing oneself in the overwhelming perfection of divine radiance. Zeus emerged as the Titan of intellect and prophecy, his mind encompassing knowledge that spanned from the moment of creation to the end of all things. Yet this vast wisdom came with a price, for to know everything was to understand the terrible weight of inevitability, to see the patterns of tragedy that would repeat themselves across generations of gods and mortals alike. His sister Phoebe brought with her the silver light of the moon and the mystery of prophecy, her voice carrying whispers of futures that were both beautiful and horrifying in their certainty. Cronus rose as the constellation maker, his domain the ordering of the heavens, though his version of order was far from the comforting patterns that would later guide lost sailors. Instead, his constellations told stories of violence and betrayal, of heroes who fell to their own hubris and monsters who devoured the innocent. Each star in his arrangements was a reminder that even in the vastness of space, there was no escape from the cruel mathematics of fate. Iapetus, whose name would become synonymous with the lineage of humanity's greatest champions and rebels, brought with him the double-edged gift of mortality and the defiance that comes with knowing one's days are numbered. In his bloodline would flow the courage to steal fire from the gods and the stubbornness to bear any punishment for the sake of principal qualities that would make his descendants both heroes and victims in the cosmic drama about to unfold. Mnemosyne, the embodiment of memory itself, held within her consciousness every moment that had ever existed, every word that had ever been spoken, every tear that had ever been shed. Yet rather than being a comfort, this infinite recollection was a burden beyond imagining, for she could never forget a single cruelty, never let go of a single moment of pain. In her perfect memory, every tragedy lived forever with the same intensity as the moment it first occurred. Themis arose as the personification of divine law and proper custom, but her justice was not the measured fairness that mortals would later pray for. Instead, it was the harsh, uncompromising order of nature itself, where the strong devoured the weak and survival was the only virtue that mattered. Her scales weighed not mercy against punishment, but power against weakness, and they were never balanced in favor of kindness. Cronus, the youngest and most faithful of the 12, came into existence with a shadow already cast across his future. Even in his earliest moments, there was something in his eyes that spoke of ambition and ruthlessness, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to claim and hold power. He would become the catalyst for the first great act of divine violence, the one whose actions would set in motion a cycle of betrayal and revenge that would echo through the ages. These 12 elder titans, along with their various siblings and offspring, formed the first dynasty of divine beings, ruling over a world that was still raw and unformed, where every mountain peak and ocean depth held secrets that could drive mortals mad with terror. They were beautiful beyond description and terrible beyond comprehension. Their very existence, a reminder that the forces that shape our reality care nothing for our comfort or our understanding. The cruelty of Uranus and the seeds of rebellion. As the Titans grew in power and number, their father Uranus began to feel the first stirrings of a fear that would consume him entirely. transforming him from the expansive, embracing sky into something cramped and suspicious. This was not the rational concern of a parent watching children grow beyond their need for guidance, but rather the paranoid terror of a tyrant who saw in every new generation a threat to his absolute dominion over creation. The sky, which had once been infinite and welcoming, began to press down upon the earth with increasing weight, as if Uranus was trying to crush the very life out of his children before they could mature enough to challenge him. Day by day, the space between heaven and earth grew smaller, until the world existed in a state of perpetual twilight, where the sun struggled to penetrate the oppressive canopy that Uranus had made of himself. But it was not enough for him merely to limit their freedom. In his growing madness, Uranus conceived of a punishment so cruel that it would haunt the collective unconscious of every culture that would ever tell his story. One by one, he began to seize his youngest children, not the mighty Titans, who were already too powerful to handle easily, but their siblings, the hundred-handed Hecatonchires, and the one-eyed Cyclopeus beings, whose only crime was existing in forms that their father found unsettling. Deep within Gaia's body, far beneath the surface of the earth, lay Tartarus, an abyss so profound that it would take a bronze anvil 9 days to fall from its rim to its floor. Into this cosmic prison, Uranus hurled his children, sealing them away in darkness so complete that it had weight and substance of its own. The Hecatonchires, whose 100 hands had been crafted to build wonders beyond imagination, found themselves with nothing to grasp but shadows and despair. The Cyclopes, whose single eyes could see across vast distances and peer into the hearts of mountains, were condemned to stare into nothingness for eternity. As each child disappeared into the depths, Gaia felt their absence like wounds that would never heal. The earth itself began to ache with the weight of injustice, mountains trembling with her suppressed rage, oceans growing dark and choppy with her sorrow. She who had given birth to sky and sea, to light and darkness, to all the wonders of creation, was being forced to become the jailer of her own children. The Titans, witnessing their father's cruelty, began to understand that their own survival depended not on filial obedience, but on their willingness to act when the moment demanded it. They gathered in secret councils, their voices barely whispers that nevertheless carried across vast distances, sharing their growing certainty that Uranus had forfeited any claim to their loyalty or respect. It was Gaia herself who finally gave voice to what they all knew must happen, though speaking the words required a courage that even the earth itself had to summon from its deepest places. In the darkness of a moonless night, when Uranus had wrapped himself particularly tightly around the world, she recalled her remaining children to her and spoke of revolution with the calm certainty of one who had already seen how the story must end. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. From the depths of her being, she would forge a weapon unlike any that had ever existed, a sickle made of adamant, the hardest substance in creation, its edge sharp enough to cut through the very fabric of reality itself. This weapon would be given to whichever of her sons had the courage to use it to lie in wait for the moment when Uranus came to embrace the earth, and in that moment of supposed intimacy to strike the blow that would end his tyranny forever. The silence that followed her words was not the quiet of doubt or hesitation, but the profound stillness that comes before a storm of such magnitude that the very foundations of existence will be shaken. Each of the Titans understood that accepting this task would mean crossing a line from which there could be no return, transforming themselves from victims of tyranny into agents of a violence so fundamental that it would reshape the very nature of divine power. One by one, 11 of the 12 Titans found reasons to step back from this ultimate responsibility. Their wisdom, or their fear, or their loyalty to some abstract notion of filial duty holding them back from the precipice. But Cronus, the youngest and perhaps the most ambitious, stepped forward without hesitation, his hand already reaching for the terrible weapon that would make him both liberator and kinslayer, hero and monster, all in the space of a single, irreversible moment. Cronus and the sickle of rebellion. The adamantine sickle that Gaia forged in the depths of her being was more than merely a weapon. It was a physical manifestation of the universe's need for change. A tool that existed not just to cut flesh, but to sever the bonds of an order that had become unbearable. As Cronus's fingers closed around its handle, he felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. The knowledge that he was about to become the hinge upon which all of cosmic history would turn. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part, those long hours of hiding in the shadows while Uranus prepared for his nightly embrace of the earth. Unaware that his youngest son crouched nearby with murder in his heart, Cronus had positioned himself carefully, choosing a spot where the darkness was deepest and his father's attention would be focused entirely on Gaia. That moment of vulnerable intimacy, when even the sky itself could be taken by surprise, as Uranus descended, his vast form blotting out the stars, the very air seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment that had been building since the first Titan drew breath, the inevitable confrontation between the old order and the new, between the fear that sought to preserve itself through cruelty and the ambition that was willing to risk everything for the chance to rule. Cronus felt his heartbeat synchronize with the rhythm of creation itself, each pulse counting down to the moment when everything would change forever. The strike, when it came, was so swift and decisive that even Uranus himself seemed not to understand what had happened. The adamantine blade moved through divine flesh as if it were nothing more than morning mist, severing not just the god's manhood, but his connection to the power that had made him master of the cosmos. His scream, when it finally came, was not the roar of rage one might expect from a wounded tyrant, but the high, thin wail of someone who has suddenly realized that they are no longer the most dangerous thing in the universe. What followed was perhaps more disturbing than the act of castration itself, for as Uranus's blood fell upon the earth, it gave birth to things that were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Where the drops struck the ground, the earth convulsed and split, giving birth to the giants. Beings of such size and fury that their very existence was a threat to the stability of creation. The ash tree nymphs sprang up like flowers in a garden, but these were no gentle woodland spirits. They were the embodiment of divine violence, given female form, their beauty masking hearts that beat with the rhythm of war. Most terrifying of all were the Furies, the Erinyes, who emerged fully formed and already ancient, their eyes burning with the fire of absolute justice and their mouths speaking curses that would echo through eternity. These were not goddesses who could be appeased with sacrifices or reasoned with through prayer, but rather the living embodiment of the principle that some crimes are so fundamental that they demand punishment across generations, that the sin of kinslaying leaves a stain that can never be washed clean. From the severed flesh itself, cast into the churning foam of the sea, arose Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. But even she carried within her the paradox of her violent birth. Her beauty was not the gentle attractiveness that comforts and soothes, but the devastating perfection that drives mortals and gods alike to acts of madness and desperation. She was love born from violence, desire emerging from destruction, a reminder that even the most beautiful aspects of existence carry within them the seeds of chaos. Uranus, wounded beyond healing and stripped of his power, retreated to the furthest reaches of the cosmos, but not before prophesying that the same fate that had befallen him would one day overtake his son. His words rang out across the universe like a curse and a promise. The declaration that the violence Cronus had unleashed would inevitably turn back upon itself, that the cycle of sons overthrowing fathers was now written into the very fabric of reality. But Cronus, drunk on his victory and the sudden rush of absolute power, paid little attention to his father's words. He had won the greatest prize in creation, the right to rule over gods and mortals alike, and in that moment of triumph, it seemed impossible that anyone could ever threaten his position, as Uranus had once seemed untouchable. The sickle that had served its purpose was set aside, but its legacy lived on in the knowledge that even the mightiest of gods could be brought low by courage, ambition, and a willingness to do what others would not dare attempt. The cosmos itself seemed to exhale as the old order died and the new began. But it was not a sigh of relief so much as the first breath of an age that would be marked by even greater violence and stranger cruelties than what had come before. The rule of the Titans had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the eternal story of power and its corruption. The reign of Cronus, fear and devouring. The golden sickle that had made Cronus king was hidden away in the deepest vaults of his palace, but its shadow fell across every decision he made as ruler of the cosmos. Where once he had been the bold young god, willing to risk everything for freedom, he now found himself consumed by the same fears that had driven his father to such cruelty. The prophecy that Uranus had spoken with his dying breath echoed in Cronus's mind like a song that could never be unlearned. The certainty that one of his own children would someday rise up to destroy him, just as he had destroyed his father. At first, Cronus told himself that he was different, that he would find some other way to secure his throne without resorting to the kind of fun monstrous acts that had defined his father's reign. He ruled wisely and well, bringing order to a cosmos that had known only chaos, establishing the foundations of law and custom that would survive long after his own reign had ended. Under his guidance, the world flourished as never before, with mortals living lives of unprecedented length and prosperity, their days unmarked by the kind of suffering that would later become commonplace. But as the years passed and Rhea, his sister and queen, began to bear him children, the old fears returned with renewed intensity. Each birth was both a joy and a terror, for every new godling that drew breath was a potential threat to everything Cronus had built. He found himself watching his children with eyes that grew more suspicious with each passing day, looking for signs of ambition or rebellion in their infant faces, seeing threats in their laughter and challenges in their tears. The first child, Hestia, was gentle and retiring, showing no interest in power or conquest. But Cronus convinced himself that this was merely a mask, that beneath her peaceful exterior lurked the same ambition that had driven him to patricide. When she was still barely more than a baby, he seized her during what should have been a moment of parental affection, his massive hands engulfing her tiny form as he opened his mouth impossibly wide and swallowed her whole. the act was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong, that even Rhea, who had stood by his side through the violence of his rise to power, could only stare in horrified disbelief. But Cronus, once the line had been crossed, found that each subsequent act of filicide became easier. The terrible logic of paranoia making each new atrocity seem not just necessary, but inevitable. Demeter followed her sister into the darkness of their father's gullet, her connection to the growing things of the earth severed in an instant, leaving the world just a little less fertile, a little less capable of sustaining life. Hera, who would have grown to be the queen of the gods, disappeared before she could take her first steps, her potential for greatness snuffed out by a father's fear of his own mortality. With each child he devoured, Cronus told himself that this would be the last, that surely he had eliminated the threat that his father's prophecy had warned him about. But the gods he had swallowed were not destroyed, merely imprisoned within his divine body, their consciousness trapped in a living tomb where they continued to grow and develop, their resentment building with each passing year. They whispered to each other in the darkness of their father's belly, sharing their memories of the brief moments of freedom they had known, planning their revenge with the patience that only the immortal can truly possess. Hades joined his sisters in this most intimate of prisons, bringing with him the cold certainty of death and the understanding that some fates are truly worse than non-existence. His presence made the interior of Cronus's body a place of shadows and whispers, where the very air seemed thick with the promise of retribution. When Poseidon was born, his first breath was also his last breath of free air, for Cronus had by now perfected the terrible ritual, timing his act so precisely that his children had no opportunity to cry out or struggle. The god of the seas disappeared into the same darkness that had claimed his siblings, adding the power of the ocean's rage to the growing storm of divine anger that churned within their father's body. With each act of cannibalism, Cronus became more isolated from his remaining family, more paranoid about potential threats, more convinced that only through the most extreme measures could he maintain his grip on power. His court became a place of whispers and fear, where even the most loyal of his followers began to wonder if their king had descended into a madness from which there could be no return. Rhea, watching her husband devour their children one by one, felt something die within her that was more fundamental than hope or love. She had stood by him through his rise to power, had accepted the violence that brought him the throne. But this systematic destruction of their own offspring was a cruelty so absolute that it transformed her from a willing partner into a secret enemy. Yet she was careful to hide her growing hatred, knowing that any sign of disloyalty would likely result in her own destruction. The cosmos itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the moment when this cycle of violence would finally reach its inevitable conclusion. The prophecy that had driven Cronus to such extremes continued to hang over him like a sword, its fulfillment now seeming not just possible, but certain. For in his attempts to prevent his downfall, he had created the very conditions that would make it not just necessary, but righteous. Rhea's desperation and the hidden child. As Rhea felt the familiar stirrings of new life within her womb, she knew with absolute certainty that she could not watch another child disappear into the darkness of Cronus's throat. The weight of 5 lost children pressed upon her heart like stones, each memory of their brief lives and sudden endings driving her toward a desperation that transcended rational thought. This 6th child would not share the fate of his siblings, regardless of what it might cost her. regardless of how dangerous it might be to deceive the most powerful being in the universe. The planning required for such deception was exhausting in its complexity, for Cronus had grown suspicious of everything and everyone around him, his paranoia making him attentive to the smallest details that might suggest treachery. Rhea knew that she would have only one chance to save her child, that any mistake would result not only in the baby's death, but likely her own as well, for there were limits to even a husband's tolerance for betrayal. As her pregnancy progressed, she began to make subtle arrangements, reaching out to trusted allies who still remembered what Cronus had been before fear had consumed him, calling in favors that dated back to the early days of his reign, when he had still been capable of inspiring loyalty rather than merely demanding it. The island of Crete, with its deep caves and hidden valleys, began to seem like the only place in the world where a divine child might grow to maturity without attracting his father's attention. The birth itself took place in darkness and secrecy, far from the golden halls where Cronus held court, in a cave so deep within Mount Ida that the very stones seemed to absorb sound and light. The labor was long and difficult, made worse by the constant fear that somehow Cronus would discover what was happening, that his divine senses would penetrate even this carefully chosen hiding place and reveal the deception before it could succeed. When the child finally emerged, his first cry echoing off the cave walls with a sound that seemed to promise future greatness, Rhea felt a mixture of joy and terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was Zeus, though she did not yet know the name that would one day shake the foundations of heaven and earth. She knew only that he was beautiful and strong, and that his father must never learn of his existence. The substitution that followed required acting skills that Rhea had never known she possessed, for she had to convince Cronus that the stone she presented to him, carefully wrapped in swaddling clothes and made warm by her body heat, was actually their newborn son. The weight was wrong, the feel was wrong. Everything about the deception should have been immediately obvious to a god of Cronus's power, but his eagerness to dispose of this latest threat to his throne made him careless in his examination. Watching her husband swallow what he believed to be their child was perhaps the most difficult moment of Rhea's entire existence, for she had to maintain the perfect mask of a grieving mother, while simultaneously hiding her relief that Zeus was safe and her growing satisfaction that Cronus had been so thoroughly deceived. The stone settled in his stomach alongside his divine children, but unlike them, it would never grow in power or plot revenge. It would simply lie there as a permanent reminder of the moment when his paranoia had finally made him vulnerable. Meanwhile, in the cave on Crete, the infant Zeus was placed in the care of the nymphs who had agreed to risk everything to raise him in secret. The curate's warrior priests, whose loyalty to the old ways of honor ran deeper than their fear of Cronus, took up positions around the cave, their shields and spears, ready to create such a clamor of noise that any sounds the baby might make would be completely masked. Day and night they danced their war dance, the clash of bronze on bronze becoming a constant percussion that announced to the world that something momentous was happening here, even if they could not say exactly what. The goat Mnemosyne provided nourishment for the growing god, her milk, containing not just the sustenance needed for physical growth, but somehow imbuing Zeus with the wildness and independence that would later make him such a formidable opponent to his father's rigid control. The bees of Mount Ida brought honey that sweetened not just his food, but his disposition, giving him the charm and charisma that would one day make him a leader that others would follow willingly rather than out of fear. As the months passed and Zeus grew from infant to child to young, god Rhea found herself living a double life of unprecedented complexity, maintaining her role as Cronus's queen while secretly nurturing the hope that her hidden son would one day grow strong enough to fulfill the prophecy that haunted her husband's dreams. Every visit to Crete was a risk. Every moment spent watching Zeus develop his powers was a gamble that could cost her everything. But the joy of seeing him thrive made every danger worthwhile. The irony was perfect in its symmetry, for just as Cronus had once hidden from his own father while planning rebellion, now his son was growing up in secret, learning the skills and gathering the strength that would eventually topple the Titan dynasty. The wheel of fate was turning once again, and with each day that Zeus grew stronger, the fulfillment of Uranus's ancient prophecy drew closer to its inevitable conclusion. The rise of Zeus and the Titanomachy, the years of hiding, were finally coming to an end, for Zeus had grown from a secret child into a young god, whose power could no longer be completely concealed, whose very presence seemed to make the air crackle with possibilities that had been dormant for too long. The time had come for him to step out of the shadows and claim his birthright. But first, he would need to free his siblings from the living prison of their father's body, a task that would require not just courage, but cunning of the highest order. Rhea, who had spent years perfecting the art of deception, now helped her son devise the plan that would bring about Cronus's downfall. The key would be a special potion prepared by Metis, the Titaness of wisdom and craft, a mixture so potent that even the king of the gods would not be able to resist its effects. This was not merely an emetic, but a compound designed to reverse the very process by which Cronus had imprisoned his children, forcing his body to give up what it had so jealously guarded. The approach required Zeus to present himself not as a threat, but as a harmless stranger, perhaps a young cupbearer whose only desire was to serve the mighty Cronus faithfully. The disguise was perfect, for who would suspect that the prophesied usurper would come bearing wine and wearing the humble clothes of a servant, rather than arriving with armies and divine weapons blazing with righteous fury? When Zeus finally stood before his father for the first time since his birth, the moment was charged with an irony so profound that it seemed to make the very fabric of reality shiver with anticipation. Cronus, who had spent decades living in fear of this confrontation, looked upon his greatest enemy and saw nothing more than an attractive young god eager to please. The paranoia that had driven him to such extremes had finally blinded him to the very thing he had been watching for, the cosmic joke that would make his downfall not just inevitable, but laughably easy. The wine was accepted with the casual indifference of one who had grown accustomed to absolute power, consumed without suspicion or ceremony its bitter aftertaste, dismissed as merely the consequence of a vintage that had perhaps been stored too long. But as the potion began to work its way through Cronus's divine system, the effects became impossible to ignore. The violent convulsions that racked his body serving as both punishment for his crimes and liberation for his victims. One by one, Zeus's siblings emerged from their father's throat, not as the helpless infants they had been when they were swallowed, but as fully grown gods whose power had been refined and concentrated by years of imprisonment and resentment. Poseidon rose like a tsunami given human form, his anger at his captivity transforming him into something that could reshape coastlines with a gesture. Hades emerged with the cold certainty of death itself, his time in darkness having taught him secrets about the nature of endings that would make him the most feared of all the gods. Hera's beauty was now tempered with a steel that had been forged by suffering, her potential for both love and vengeance magnified by the injustice she had endured. Demeter brought with her the fury of a harvest that has been denied too long, her power over growing things now carrying an edge of terrible judgment. Hestia, though still gentle, had acquired a strength that came from understanding that sometimes peace can only be preserved through violence. The stone that had served as Zeus's substitute was the last thing to emerge, and Cronus, seeing it for what it truly was, finally understood the magnitude of the deception that had been practiced upon him. The rage that filled him was not just the anger of a tyrant who had been outwitted, but the deeper fury of a father who realized that his own wife had been his enemy for years, that every moment of apparent domestic tranquility had been a lie designed to facilitate his destruction. But his rage, however justified, came too late to change anything, for Zeus and his siblings were already taking their positions for the war that would reshape the cosmos. The Olympians, as they would come to be known, had advantages that their father's generation had never possessed, for they fought not just for power, but for justice, not just for victory, but for the right to create a world where the strong did not automatically devour the weak. The Titanomachy that followed was not a war in any conventional sense, but rather a cosmic upheaval that lasted for 10 years and involved forces so fundamental that their clash could be felt in every corner of existence. Mountains were hurled like stones, oceans boiled away to nothing, and then reformed in entirely new configurations. The very laws of physics seemed to bend and break under the pressure of divine will made manifest through violence. Zeus proved to be not just a powerful warrior, but a brilliant strategist. Understanding that victory would require more than raw strength, he freed the Cyclopes from their long imprisonment in Tartarus, and in gratitude, they forged for him the thunderbolts that would become his signature weapon, bolts of pure cosmic energy that could shatter even the strongest Titan defenses. The hecatangers, their 100 hands finally given meaningful work to do, became siege engines of unprecedented effectiveness, hurling boulders with the rhythm of a heartbeat and the accuracy of divine mathematics. Not all of the Titans sided with Cronus in this conflict, for some recognized that the old order had become corrupt beyond redemption, and chose to support the younger gods who promised a more just form of rule. Prometheus, whose gift of foresight allowed him to see how the war would end, provided crucial intelligence to Zeus's forces. Themis, understanding that true justice required change, offered her wisdom to help establish the foundations of a new cosmic order. As the war dragged on, it became clear that this was not just a struggle between two generations of gods, but a fundamental choice about what kind of universe would emerge from the conflict. Would it be one where power was maintained through fear and cruelty, where strength alone determined right and wrong? Or would it be something more complex and ultimately more hopeful, a cosmos where even the gods themselves would be subject to some form of justice and restraint? The fall of the Titans and their punishments. The final battle of the Titanomachy was not decided by a single dramatic confrontation, but rather by the slow, inevitable realization that the old order had exhausted its capacity for resistance. One by one, the Titans who had supported Cronus found themselves overwhelmed by forces they could not match, their ancient powers proving insufficient against the combination of youth, innovation, and righteous anger that drove their opponents forward. Cronus himself, weakened by the loss of his swallowed children and psychologically shattered by the revelation of his wife's betrayal, fought with the desperation of someone who knew that defeat would mean not just the loss of power, but the end of everything he had ever believed about himself. His attacks were wild and unfocused, driven more by rage than strategy, and Zeus was able to avoid his father's strikes while landing blow after blow with the thunderbolts that never seemed to miss their mark. When Cronus finally fell, it was not with the dramatic defiance one might expect from a king of the gods, but rather with a kind of exhausted bewilderment, as if he still could not quite understand how the world had changed so completely around him. The sickle that had made him ruler lay broken beside him, its adamantine blade finally shattered by forces greater than even its divine metallurgy could withstand. The other Titans who had chosen the wrong side in this cosmic civil war were gathered together like prisoners of war, their divine status offering them no protection from the judgment of the victors. Atlas, who had served as one of Cronus's most effective generals, was selected for a punishment that was both symbolic and practical. Condemned to hold up the heavens for all eternity, his strength becoming the foundation that would prevent sky and earth from crushing each other in a final embrace. The irony of Atlas's fate was particularly cruel, for he who had fought to preserve the old order now became the literal support for the new one, his suffering serving as a constant reminder that even the mightiest could be brought low by opposing the will of Zeus. Every day for the rest of time, he would feel the weight of the cosmos pressing down upon his shoulders, a burden that could never be set aside, never be shared, never be escaped through death or madness or any other form of release. For the other defeated Titans, Zeus decreed a different but no less terrible punishment: exile to Tartarus, that same abyss into which Uranus had once cast the Cyclopes and Hecatontures. But this was not the Tartarus of the early cosmos, a place of simple imprisonment, but rather something that had been transformed by eons of suffering into a realm of exquisite and eternal torment, where the very air was thick with the weight of despair, and the walls themselves seemed to weep with the accumulated tears of the damned. The journey to Tartarus was itself a form of punishment, for the defeated Titans were marched across the entire breadth of creation, their chains dragging behind them like the sound of cosmic judgment. Their former subjects watching in silence as their gods were led away to face a fate that was arguably worse than death. The procession moved with the slow inevitability of a funeral cortege, each step taking them further from the light and warmth of the upper world and closer to the cold eternity that awaited them below. Tartarus had been prepared for its new inhabitants with a care that spoke to Zeus' understanding that true justice required punishments that fit not just the crime but the criminal. The prison was not merely a place of physical confinement, but a realm where each Titan would face their own personal version of hell, their individual weaknesses and fears magnified into instruments of eternal torment. For Cronus, the punishment was perhaps the most fitting of all, for he was placed in a cell where time moved differently than in the rest of creation, where each moment stretched into hours, each hour into days, giving him an infinity in which to contemplate the choices that had brought him to this end. The paranoia that had driven him to devour his children now became a constant companion, whispering in his ear about dangers that could never materialize, threats that could never be faced, escape routes that would always prove to be illusions. The bronze gates of Tartarus, forged by the Cyclopes, with the same skill they had brought to Zeus's thunderbolts, were sealed with locks that existed not just in the physical realm, but in the very fabric of reality itself. No key could open them, no strength could break them, no cleverness could circumvent them, for they were held shut by the weight of cosmic justice itself, the accumulated force of every choice that had led to this moment. Yet even in their defeat and imprisonment, the Titans retained their essential nature, their fundamental connection to the forces that governed reality. They were not destroyed but contained, not eliminated but controlled, their power redirected from creation and rule to serving as a foundation for the new order that Zeus was building upon the ruins of the old. In a sense, they became part of the cosmic infrastructure, their strength channeled into maintaining the very system that had defeated them. The silence that settled over Tartarus was not the quiet of death, but the hush of a library where ancient books wait to be read, where knowledge and power lie dormant but not extinct, where the possibility of change still exists even in the depths of the most secure prison ever constructed. It was a silence that spoke of patience beyond mortal understanding, of the kind of endurance that only the immortal could possess, of the possibility that even the most final-seeming endings might prove to be merely very long intermissions. The lasting shadows of the Titans, even with the war won and the defeated Titans safely imprisoned in the depths of Tartarus, their influence upon the world could not be completely erased, for they had been woven too deeply into the fabric of creation to simply disappear without trace. Their legacy lived on in the children who had chosen different paths, in the forces of nature that still bore their fingerprints in the very structure of reality that they had helped to establish during their long reign over the cosmos. Prometheus, who had sided with Zeus during the Great War, found that his loyalty to the new order was more complex than simple allegiance, for his gift of foresight allowed him to see not just the benefits that would come from Olympian rule, but also the dangers and injustices that would inevitably arise when any group possessed absolute power. His decision to steal fire from the gods and give it to humanity was not an act of simple rebellion, but rather an attempt to create some form of balance to ensure that mortals would not remain forever at the mercy of divine whim. The punishment that Zeus devised for this act of defiance was cruel in its precision, for Prometheus was chained to a peak in the Caucasus Mountains, where an eagle would come each day to tear open his side and devour his liver, the organ regenerating each night only to be consumed again the following day. This was suffering refined to its purest essence, an eternal cycle of agony that served not just as punishment for past crimes, but as a warning to any who might consider similar acts of defiance in the future. Yet Prometheus endured his torment with a dignity that spoke to something noble in the Titan nature, something that transcended the crude dynamics of power and submission that had driven so much of the conflict between the generations. His daily agony became a testament to the possibility that even the most terrible punishments could be transformed into a form of victory, that suffering willingly accepted in service of a greater good could be more powerful than any throne or crown. Atlas, bearing his eternal burden, became a different kind of symbol, representing not the nobility of willing sacrifice, but the crushing weight of responsibility that falls upon those who choose the wrong side in cosmic conflicts. Yet even his punishment carried within it a strange form of honor, for without his strength, the entire structure of reality would collapse, making him simultaneously victim and guardian, prisoner and protector of everything that existed. The other Titans, who had survived the war by choosing neutrality or wisdom found themselves in positions that were both privileged and precarious. For Zeus valued their knowledge and experience, while remaining forever watchful for signs of disloyalty or ambition. They became advisors and counselors, their ancient wisdom helping to shape the new world, even as their power remained strictly limited by the terms of their surrender. In the realm of mortal understanding, the Titans became symbols of forces that were larger than human comprehension, but not entirely beyond human sympathy, representing the terrible majesty of nature in its most untamed forms. They were the earthquake that could level cities, the volcano that could bury civilizations, the flood that could remake entire continents. But they were also the fertile soil that made harvests possible, the waters that sustained life, the fires that made technology and culture achievable. Their stories became cautionary tales about the dangers of absolute power and the inevitability of change. But they were also reminders that even the mightiest forces could be brought low by their own choices, that strength without wisdom was ultimately self-defeating, that the refusal to adapt and grow could turn even the greatest advantages into fatal weaknesses. The mythic resonance of the Titans extended far beyond the boundaries of Greek culture, for they represented archetypal patterns that appeared in the foundational stories of every civilization. The eternal struggle between order and chaos, between the established powers and the forces of renewal, between the safety of the known and the dangerous possibilities inherent in change. In the depths of Tartarus, the imprisoned Titans served as a reminder that no victory is ever completely final, that even the most secure-seeming order contains within it the seeds of its own transformation. Their presence in the cosmic basement, so to speak, was both a source of stability and a constant threat for as long as they existed. The possibility remained that the wheel of fate might turn once again, bringing with it changes that would make the Titanomachy seem like merely the first chapter in a much longer story. Their children and grandchildren, scattered throughout the world, carried forward aspects of their nature that could not be completely suppressed or controlled, ensuring that the wild, untamed essence of the Titan legacy would continue to manifest in new forms and new challenges to whatever order might temporarily establish itself as dominant. Reflections in the darkness. As our long journey through the shadows of these ancient myths draws toward its close, we find ourselves confronted with questions that have no easy answers, stories that reveal as much about the darkness within human nature as they do about the imagined lives of gods and titans. The cycle of violence that defined the rise and fall of these primordial powers was not merely a product of their alien, divine psychology, but rather a reflection of patterns that repeat themselves wherever intelligent beings struggle for dominance and control. The tale of Cronus devouring his children speaks to fears that transcend the boundaries of mythology, touching upon the universal terror that those who love us most might also be those most capable of destroying us, that the very relationships that should provide safety and nurturing can become sources of the most profound trauma. In every generation, there are those who, like Cronus, become so consumed by their fear of losing power that they destroy the very things they claim to be protecting. The rebellion of Zeus and his siblings offers a different, but equally troubling model, for their victory was achieved not through moral superiority, but through superior force and better alliances, their justice validated not by its inherent rightness, but by their success in imposing it upon their enemies. The new order they established was undoubtedly preferable to the paranoid tyranny of Cronus. But it was still an order based upon the principle that might makes right, that the strong have the authority to determine the fate of the weak. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the way these myths normalize and even celebrate violence as a necessary component of progress, suggesting that meaningful change can only be achieved through acts of destruction so complete that they reshape the very foundations of reality. The sickle that Cronus used to castrate his father became a symbol not just of rebellion, but of the idea that some problems can only be solved through irreversible acts of violence. Yet there is something hauntingly beautiful about these stories as well. Something that speaks to the human capacity for hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Rhea's desperate gamble to save Zeus, Atlas's stoic endurance of his eternal punishment, Prometheus's willingness to suffer for the sake of humanity. All of these represent moments when individual choice transcended the larger patterns of cosmic cruelty. When love or principle or simple stubbornness proved stronger than fear. The Titans themselves, for all their flaws and failures, possessed a grandeur that the more familiar Olympian gods often lacked, a connection to the raw forces of creation that made them simultaneously more alien and more authentic than their successors. They were the embodiment of a world that had not yet learned to moderate its extremes, where every emotion was absolute, every conflict was total, every consequence was eternal. In their imprisonment in Tartarus, they achieved a kind of immortality that was different from the simple deathlessness of the gods, for they became permanent features of the cosmic landscape, their presence, a constant reminder that no victory is ever final, no order ever completely secure. They wait in the darkness beneath the world, not plotting revenge or planning escape, but simply enduring with the patience that only the truly defeated can possess. Their legacy lives on in every story of generational conflict, every tale of the young overthrowing the old, every myth that attempts to explain why the world is the way it is by imagining how it might have been different. They are the shadows that give definition to the light, the chaos that makes order meaningful, the questions that make answers seem worthwhile. As you drift toward sleep, carrying these dark and beautiful stories with you into the realm of dreams, remember that myths like these are not merely entertainment or historical curiosities, but rather maps of the human psyche, guides to the territories of fear and hope that we all must navigate in our own lives. They remind us that even in the face of cosmic indifference and divine cruelty, individual choices still matter, that love and courage and wisdom can still make a difference, even if that difference is smaller and more temporary than we might wish. The Titans ruled their age and passed away, as all rulers must, but in their passing, they left behind something more valuable than any throne or crown. They left behind stories that continue to speak to us across the centuries, whispering their ancient truths into the darkness, reminding us that we are all participants in a drama larger than ourselves, all players in a story that began before our birth and will continue long after our death. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is everything, to be part of something greater than ourselves, to add our own small chapter to the endless book of existence, to face our own fears and failures with the same stubborn dignity that the Titans displayed in their defeat. The darkness that surrounds us is vast and full of unknowable dangers, but it is also full of possibilities, and in that paradox lies the strange comfort that these ancient myths continue to offer to those brave enough to listen to their whispered wisdom. Sleep well and dream of gods and monsters, of the price of power and the courage required to challenge it, of the eternal cycles that bind us all together in the great dance of creation and destruction that has been going on since the first stirring of consciousness in the primordial void, and will continue until the last star burns out in the cosmic darkness that awaits us all.